Hi guys, so today we're going to be talking about glacier erosion and depositional features. So, what is a glacier? A glacier is a large mass of compacted snow and ice that moves under the force of gravity. So, you might have heard of avalanches. Avalanches are basically glaciers moving slowly downhill because of gravity, and that causes a lot of issues for people when they encounter an avalanche. But when a glacier moves, and it moves very slowly because of gravity, it starts to alter the landscape through erosion and deposition, and that's what we're focusing on today. So when glacier ice melts, it produces something called meltwater. So glacier is a giant chunk of ice, right? But depending on the climate, the glacier may start to melt a little bit, and we call that molten water, I guess. Meltwater, and meltwater kind of looks like this in a glacier. Now, another thing that a glacier forms is something called a moraine. When a glacier moves, and we said it moves because of gravity very slowly, it starts to push the sediments in front of it, kind of like a bulldozer almost. And we call this a moraine. So when the glacier ice moves, as you can see in this GIF, it starts to push the sediments that are already in front of it forward very slowly, right? And when pushes or bulldozes it forward, it creates this ridge-like thing of sediments, kind of like this picture right here. And we call these ridges moraines. So remember the vocabulary here. And if you need to write this down in your notebook, go ahead. Meltwater is when glacier ice melts. And moraines are when glaciers push the sediments in front of them to create a ridge-like shape. Now, this is meltwater. This is a moraine or moraines. Now, just like rivers, we've spoken about rivers before, right? When rivers enter the ocean, they start to become sorted, meaning they start to group the sediments or deposit the sediments in a grouped manner by size and shape. Because first they drop the boulders, because boulders are larger size, right? And then cobbles, and then pebbles, and then sand, silt, clay precipitates. And this creates sorted sediments because we're grouping the boulders and cobbles and pebbles and sand and silt in different locations. Meltwater does the same thing. So any sort of water, when it starts to slow down and starts to deposit its sediments, it will start to deposit sediments in a sorted manner. It starts to group the sediments by size and shape because it can't hold on to the bigger sediments, so it will drop those sediments faster or early on when it enters the ocean, and then later it will drop the lighter sediments or smaller sediments. So go ahead and write this down in your notes. Glaciers, the depositional, remember they create U-shaped valleys, and the depositional feature that they create are meltwater and moraine, right? And meltwater, just like rivers, creates sorted sediments, meaning all the sediments are grouped by the same size and shape. So let's talk about moraines. Now, moraines are we don't require water with moraines, right? Moraines are just created when the ice from the glacier pushes like a bulldozer the sediments in front of it, and the sediments end up looking like a ridge, kind of like this. And notice the sediments are different sizes and shapes. We have giant boulders and very fine sand as well. So when sediments are deposited at a moraine, they are unsorted. When meltwater deposits sediments, they're very sorted, but when sediments are deposited by moraines, they are unsorted. Let's write that down. Moraines deposit unsorted sediments. Meltwater deposits sorted sediments. Remember these vocabulary words. Now, here's a way to remember this. Any sort of ice, or even gravity, right? Because glaciers move by gravity. If any ice is depositing sediments, for instance, if the sediments are being carried directly by a glacier and then deposited, those sediments will be unsorted. Kind of like this, they'll be all different shapes and sizes. But if the sediments are being carried by water, such as a river or meltwater from a glacier, then those sort of sediments will be sorted because water, when it starts to slow down, it will deposit the largest sediments first and then the smaller sediments as it goes deeper in the ocean. Okay, so water, sorted sediments, ice, or gravity, unsorted sediments. So go ahead and try number 10, pause this video. A glacial moraine is best described as A. Unsorted sediment directly deposited by a glacier. B. Sorted sediment deposited as a glacier melts. C. A body of water formed by a retreating glacier. Or D. An elongated hill composed of sand and formed by a retreating glacier. The correct answer is A. When a glacier moraine deposits sediments, they're unsorted and they're directly deposited by a glacier. It's not meltwater that's depositing the sediments. So, what are some other features that glaciers create? Glaciers, when they move, it's a large chunk of ice, right? That ice starts to scratch the ground as it moves, and we call these scratches on the ground striations. If you go to Central Park, you'll find giant boulders with striations or scratches on them. That's because New York or North America in general used to be covered by a glacier. We had an ice age, and that glacier left behind some evidence that there was a glacier. For instance, striations on the giant boulders. Okay, and these striations also help us figure out which way the glacier moved. Another thing a glacier forms are kames and kettle lakes. We're focusing mostly on kettle lakes today. So sometimes when a glacier starts to melt, it starts to retreat or move back, right? The ice is starting to melt, we're losing ice. But sometimes what happens is the glacier leaves blocks or chunks of ice behind as it starts to melt away. Okay? And those blocks or chunks of ice eventually turn into small little lakes called kettle lakes. And here's how it forms. The first thing that happens is the glacier leaves behind a chunk of ice, right? Number one, ice breaks off the glacier. The second thing that happens is that ice over time starts to become covered by sediments. So more sediments start to erode and deposit on top of this ice, and the ice starts to get buried by sediments. Eventually, though, that ice will melt. So, what will happen is as the ice melts away, we start to create a tiny little hole here called a kettle hole. Okay. And there's groundwater underneath the ground, right? That groundwater starts to fill up this hole, the kettle hole, and create a lake called a kettle lake. And these are the examples of kettle lakes. They're found all over Long Island. So, number one, to form a kettle lake, ice needs to break off a glacier. The ice gets buried by sediment, the ice melts to form a hole, and that hole gets filled with water. We form a kettle lake like that, and it looks like this. Finally, glaciers also form something called drumlins, and drumlins look kind of like this. I don't even know what shape to call this, like elevated triangular shape. So drumlins are long, elongated hills formed by glaciers, and they help us understand this direction of glacier movement. We don't exactly know or have full evidence of how these drumlins form. We just know they are formed by glaciers. And if you see a drumlin like this, we know the glacier was probably moving this way. Okay? And this is what a real life drumlin looks like. They're very common in Long Island as well. So here's a review of what we just talked about. Here's a glacier. Glaciers, when they melt, they form meltwater. And remember, meltwater deposits sorted sediments. When glaciers push sediments in front of it or bulldoze sediments, they create these ridges called moraines. And moraines deposit unsorted sediments, meaning the sediments are all different shapes and sizes. Glaciers can also form drumlins. Drumlins look like these, and they help us find the direction of the glacier. They also form kettle lakes that look like this. When ice is left behind, those ice blocks will melt, form a hole, and get filled with water called kettle lakes. So remember kettle lakes, drumlins, meltwater sorted, moraine unsorted. So go ahead and write this down in your notes. Some depositional features for glaciers are kettle lakes and drumlins. Drumlins look like this. Remember this image. So for glacial features, it's very important that you remember these words and remember what they look like as well. So go ahead and pause this video, try number 11. The cross-section below represents how a present-day glacial landscape feature was formed in Mendon Ponds Park and its appearance at present. So 11,000 years ago, we had a buried ice block, right? Because of the glacier was melting, it looks like. And then today, this is what it looks like. It's filled with water. So which glacial landscape feature is indicated in the present-day cross-section? In other words, what's this? The correct answer is D. Kettle Lake. Kettle Lake is formed when an ice block is left behind. It melts, creates a hole, and gets filled with water. We haven't talked about kames, finger lakes, or eschers, so you don't have to pick that. Number 12. Go ahead and pause this video. Try number 12. The aerial photograph below shows an elongated hill near the Finger Lakes formed by glacial deposition in New York State. This elongated hill is best identified as. The correct answer is D. Drumlin. Drumlins look like this, right? And that's it. So we've covered our mini unit erosion and depositional features. Remember, streams create deltas that look like this. Erosion happens on the outside of the curve of a meander or a curved stream. Deposition happens on the inside. You can draw a capital letter D to figure out where deposition happens. Streams form V-shaped valleys. Streams also form sorted sediments or deposit sorted sediments. The larger sediments are deposited first when the river or stream enters the ocean. The smaller sediments are deposited last. You can find the sizes of sediments in your reference table, page 6. When rivers are carrying sediments, those sediments start to go through abrasion, meaning rubbing against other rocks, and therefore they become smaller and rounder. Now, when it comes to erosion and deposition, wherever you have erosion, in the cross section of the stream or underwater, the erosion side will look a little lower because sediments are moved away from that location, and the deposition side, Y, will look higher underwater, okay? Because we're depositing sediments there. Barrier islands look like this. Remember this picture, and they're formed by wave action. Remember all these drainage patterns, how water flows in different landscapes. In a mountain, it will look like this. In a trellis, like this. The water will flow like this, and so on. For glaciers, glaciers create U-shaped valleys. The depositional features they create are meltwater, kettle lakes, drumlins, and moraines. Meltwater creates sorted sediments. Moraines create unsorted sediments. Remember this picture for drumlins. And that's it for today. Bye.